Hi, everyone. I'm here with Converse Contender and Craig Reed, and we are going to do some really exciting stuff today. We're going to review a video by Matt Dillahunty and Glen Scrivener, and it was a debate that I just watched. They just had it a few days ago on the 10th, and it was hosted on the Unbelievable channel with Justin Brierley. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to offer commentary and review this debate. So hold on one second. I'm just seeing that I've got noise in this other area. So before we do that, let me go ahead and ask Converse Contender and Craig both to introduce themselves and to let you guys know a little bit about them. They both have channels and the channels are linked in my description.
Yeah, so I'm Converse Contender. I basically just, my name is Will. I basically just have discussions with people and try to get to the bottom of issues that philosophy, biblical, all type of different subjects and segments. But I'm nobody. I have a small channel, and as my friend Ask Yourself said last night when he came on, I usually don't come on channels with as lowest presence as you, but I like you.
Does he have a big channel? Ask Yourself.
Yeah, he has like 20,000 subs.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we need to. So if you're just watching this right now, please go down to the description and like and subscribe to Craig and Converse's channels. That would be really cool.
Yes,
Craig,
definitely.
do you want to introduce yourself?
Nobody yet. Say I'm nobody yet.
Right.
Yes, my name is Craig Reed, TCR. I think I have. Oh, wait a second. I think I even have a smaller channel than Converse Contender. But like I said, that's for the time being. And I interview a lot of atheists. I do like makeshift apologetics, and put out a lot of commentary videos on stuff that's going on right now, like debates and things like that. And it's fun. It's a cool little channel. We have a nice little time.
It is an awesome channel, but let me just say this: you don't have a smaller channel than I do. You got more.
Oh,
subs
really?
than me.
Are you?
Yeah.
Well, give you
I just
like
started
2 weeks.
a couple months ago.
Yeah, give you like 2 weeks.
Oh,
I've been on it
whatever.
for a year, I think, or 2 years, or something.
I'm
like
a big fan of Craig's channel as well.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
go
I'm a
ahead,
friend of
definitely
his
like
channel.
and subscribe. So right now, what you're seeing on the screen is Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is a famous, I'll say famous or infamous, depending on how you want to think about it, atheist. He has been part of this thing called the Atheist Experience. He runs that out of Austin, Texas. And tomorrow, Matt Dillahunty is going to be debating inspiring philosophy in Austin live with the Modern Day Debate with James Kuntz of the Modern Day Debate. So they're going to be live tomorrow night. And so one of the purposes of today's discussion is going to be to talk about our predictions for that debate based on how Matt performed in this most recent debate with Glen Scrivener. And so I've moved the debate to start it at 20 minutes in just because I want to make sure we get to the real meat of this debate and not have the introductions. We're just going to move right into the debate, and Craig and Converse and I are going to offer our opinions of it. So are you ready to go, everybody?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so here we go.
Let's do it.
All right, so let's move in here. And so when you want me to take a break, just say break now. So here we go.
Okay.
Yes, speaking kind of colloquially, of course it can be like that because there are humans involved, and this is what humans do. My only concern with religions at all is there any good reason to believe they're true? I would not, people will say, oh, religion's never done anything good. Well, that's crap. Religions have done lots of good things. Or actually, more accurately, people who are religious have done good things. They've given us universities, hospitals. That would be true probably as much for secular people as well if it weren't for a disparity in the sort of privileged position that religion has had and benefited from for all these years. Secular organizations had to do a lot more fighting and in a lot more recent time just to get a similar status. For example, tax exempt status in the United States. It's just, if you're a religion, as long as you're one of the recognized religions, you're just granted it de facto. We're a Baptist church, we're a Catholic church, we're a Unitarian Universalist. Even the Buddhists had to fight for property tax exemption in Austin because it wasn't on the list of like approved religions. Okay. The Satanic Temple just recently got approved by the, pretty sure it's the IRS, as a religious organization, so they can have a tax exempt status. And that always seems strange to me. I realize I'm in the UK talking about American politics, but I've always had a problem with the notion that, in the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, where we get to this notion that you are tax exempt because you're a religious organization is incredibly convoluted, and it puts the government in a strange position of saying, hey, you're a church, you're not a church. How do you allow that decision to be made at the government level and not come to the conclusion that there's a necessary problem there with entanglement between religion and government? Because if the religion can decide which, or if the government can decide which religions are good enough for tax exempt,
yeah, and that was a big
problem.
issue with Scientology, wasn't it? A few years ago, they
fought like
a
crazy.
big battle to be recognized as a religion.
Let's note, just for fun, that the Satanic Temple just got tax exempt status. So I'm not sure what criteria is used, but that should be noted.
Yeah, and that's also like that's a really bizarre standard issue anti-theist talking point that they put way too much significance on. See, religions are tax exempt. That's why X, Y, Z, PDQ. I've never understood that one. I think we missed his opening, Glen's opening. So I don't know if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I think she moved it up to the part where we can kind of get past like the formalities and get right to the meat of the conversation. But there was like two things there that I'd want to note. One is Matt pointed out that like all that really matters is if it's true or not, and I can agree with that. You know, I said that I was on a discussion with Sock Account and Raging Atheist and Dragnot and a few other people, and they were asking about how, you know, I heard that Christianity is supposed to be helpful or whatever the case may be, and I just said like, well, I mean, whether it's helpful, that's, you know, we can talk about that, but like I'm just concerned if it's true or not. And so I agree with Matt on that. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was, so I get where he's coming from partially with this, where he's saying like, well, you know, the state has to decide, but the state has to decide on all kind of issues like this. Like take, for example, I grew up skateboarding, so I'm a fan of skateboarding. Well, in cities, they're making bike lanes and they're making these bike trails all over, like the city I live in, for example. They made it throughout the entire, like almost cutting all the way through downtown where there used to be a railroad track. They made it into a bike trail. And then skateboarding is illegal in downtown. You can't ride a skateboard in downtown. So they already have to choose between things, right? So that's just an ethical thing that we're going to have to talk about. But the other thing is, like, I think this could be a slippery slope. I don't want to commit the slippery slope fallacy, but atheists, I think if they're going to go, they can look at these little issues like this and go, you know, these are issues. But like David Silverman, for example, he got so far off where he opened up his closet on a show one day and showed that he had a bulletproof vest, and he's like, atheists got it so bad, I have to wear this bulletproof vest, and like we can't even go to some African countries, and I'm like, that's just too far. Like, woe is me, atheist. That's just too far. But like if you're talking about like, hey, what should we do about tax status and things like this, I can understand there should be a conversation there, but it's, you know, just, you know, I would be careful like how far I wanted to take that down to like, woe is me, atheist. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see your point. I just, I'm looking at the chat. Just want to let the people in the chat know that I'm watching the chat. I'm monitoring it from a different computer. And on the chat, I see JB says, because he's got a wrench, that Craig cannot mute him.
I'm gonna get him banished if he's not careful. I'm gonna proposition Stephanie to get you like blacklisted from even being allowed to watch things. There's a lot I can do, JB. So, you know, don't sleep easy on that. Just your wrench status is like, you know, Stephanie and I have been fighting about that for the last 3 weeks or the last 3 days. I'm like, I can't believe you gave him a wrench. She's like, I wanted to. He's nice.
It's so funny. Okay, so here we go. We're going to listen to some more of Matt. So
yeah, go for it.
Hold on.
Yeah, production company producing different types of media, as you would find a Christian media production company like ours, producing different programs and so on. Are you the equivalent of the atheist TV evangelist, or is that not quite fair?
God, I hope not. I think
you haven't got the hair for it. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think I operate considerably differently, because it's not so much that if you watch the televangelist, what I see is there's communication coming from them. Ours instead is caller driven.
Okay.
Somebody calls in and tells me what they want. We have a discussion. Sometimes it gets heated. Sometimes I can be awful. I can be arrogant, condescending on occasion. Sometimes I hang up too quickly. But a lot of it is, I mean, it's all genuinely an attempt to, all right, let's figure out where our disagreements are. It's just that with people, with our call-in show, I'm not dealing with somebody who spent their life studying it, somebody who has some expertise in this. It's just the average believer most of the time. And because of that, they can't often distinguish between attacking a belief and attacking the person who holds the belief. And so even when you're not attempting to make anything personal, it might still be taken personally. It's a fine line to walk, and nobody's going to get it right all the time. But I think it's been incredibly valuable, not just in the fact that, we have thousands of people who would say, hey, I'm an atheist now, or I'm a skeptic now because of what you've done on the show, but also because there are plenty of Christian apologists and preachers that I've made friends with over the years who still value that kind of conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're all about having the conversation here as well. So it's great to have you on the show today. Glenn, great to have you as well.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit of your background. You kind of grew up in a Christian setting. Was that always the case? Or?
Yeah, grew up in a church-going home. And I think during my teenage years, though, I went to youth group and was the kid with the hand in the air getting the answers right. If you stick with Jesus, you're kind of onto a winner.
I just want to note, I accidentally got to the beginning. I'm going to go back to where we were just a minute ago. So I'm sorry for that little distraction. I wanted to get past the introduction. So let me get back over here. So
to this notion that you are tax exempt because you're a religious organization.
Ask those people on any kinds of measures of reproduction. How many babies do you have? Longer life? Are you happier? Will you have more of a resistance?
So notice what he's doing here. I just want to point this out. What Glen Scrivener is doing is he's pointing to a number of academic studies, meta-analytic studies, that have identified positive effects of intrinsic religiosity. So he's actually listing a bunch of objective outcomes, meaning they're not subjective opinions, such as things like birth rates and that sort of thing. So I just want to point that out.
Resistance to depression, to recovery from illness, recovery from surgery? Do you have a resistance to divorce, to suicide? There are any number of factors where an intrinsic religiosity, that is a body of people who are saying that their religion means the world to them, those people thrive in a world where if the government was able to put that into the water, if they were able to put a magic elixir into the water that could deliver those benefits, longer life, for goodness sakes, happier, healthier, they give more money to charity. They give more money to secular charities than secular people do. They give more time to secular charities than secular people do. They give more blood than secular people give. All these things have been demonstrated in thousands of studies. So throw that into the mix as a government is looking at what will lead to the flourishing of society, what could make society better. Actually, intrinsic religiosity is something that could definitely do that. So,
here's where.
So let's talk about a strategy that Matt is going to have to use to try to downplay these studies. What do you guys suspect he's going to do? I already know what he's going to do, but I want to see how would you counter this claim?
Well, the problem is, and this is where Matt finds himself in a pickle, because that's pretty much case closed. There's a bunch of studies, and they all point almost unanimously, maybe not unanimously, to a similar conclusion. There are sociological benefits of intrinsic religiosity. Bang, that's it. So there aren't too many ways you can go with it. One of the things that Matt does more successfully here is he shifts the topic to general philosophical speculations. And there's nobody as good as him on just talking smack about God and speculating. But in the other one, he got beat, so he wasn't really prepared for the topic as well. But ultimately, I think he's aware of the fact that you're going to enter into debate that you really can't win if you want to keep your intellectual integrity, because the facts point to the conclusion. The conclusion is evidence-based, and it's pretty much, what he just said is the truth, right?
Right. Yeah, and thousands of studies, meta-analytic studies, which basically what those are is compilations of other studies. So somebody takes and they take a whole bunch of studies, they put them all together and they look at the effect sizes and they look at what the relationships are between particular variables, and intrinsic religiosity in all of these studies is positive. I mean, that's the overwhelming result. There's all sorts of positive outcomes. So what Matt's going to do is the same strategy he did with IP on the exact same topic. So what he did was he pulls out a study from Gregory S. Paul. But the interesting thing is Glen Scrivener is waiting for him to do that. In fact, later in the debate, Matt hints that Glen had set him up.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this is that what I think Matt has done so well over the years is that he knows the argument on the other side, and that he's already prepared a rebuttal, so that the other side, if they haven't heard the rebuttal, then when they pull out their old, their old
talking
argument
points,
from,
right?
Yeah, talking points.
They run a script, he kills them, and he even anticipates the script word for word. He did that with Psy. Go ahead.
Right, and so I think that's what Scrivener does well here, is that he's already prepared because he already realizes, like, and he kind of humorously says something like, "Yeah, you've been running that same study for 15 years or something," and I just thought that was a good move on his part, because I thought it was interesting to see how that's what Matt typically does, because I think that's what Matt does so well, is he
right. Well, what my
Yeah.
guess is, and this is just a guess, but Matt Dillahunty is going to at some point move into the camp of a Adam Friended, Jordan Peterson. I don't know that I believe in God, but I recognize the sociological utility of religion.
Right.
Atheist, because
Brett Weinstein,
yeah, because it's the facts support it. I mean, ultimately, you can't stay in Aaron Ra and still be in debates with, like, this guy seems like a first-rate intellectual to me. You're going to lose the debate. You're eventually going to have to get with reality. And most atheists would accept that if the evidence points to the conclusion. An evidence-based conclusion is what you base your beliefs on. And if the evidence is that as rock solid as it seems to be in this particular case, I would expect, the smarter atheists to yield, to start going, maybe let me rethink anti-theism, because it looks like there is sociological utility in religion.
Yeah, but I also like what Scrivener did there. He said, when Matt asked the question, like, well, what about tax exempt status? Like, he already, had thought about it and thought, well,
yeah,
it's because of the benefits to the population. We have studies that show, for example, that it's intrinsic religiosity is helps with crime and other things like that. So I thought that was a good move.
Oh yeah, great segue. So here's what he's going to do. He's going to bring up this Gregory S. Paul study. So we're going to listen to that, and then we'll listen to what Scrivener says about that. And then I've got a little commentary on that particular study, because I pulled it today and read it, and I'll offer that in just a moment. So here we go.
Here's where we get to disagreement, but it's going to be difficult.
Okay.
Because I don't have access to go look at studies and everything else. Mm-hmm. But if you do a Google search for religiosity versus societal health, there's a study that was done years ago that was in the Journal of Religious Education. I'm going to get
2005. Is it Gregory S. Paul?
Yes, Gregory S. Paul.
Yeah,
which
paleontologist.
Shows something different. But
yeah,
in any case,
a paleontologist who was actually hacked off with creationists. You go to Wikipedia and you find Gregory S. Paul.
But that's all about Gregory S. Paul. I'm talking about his data.
You've been quoting him for 15 years, though.
I know, but I'm quoting his data, not him.
Yeah, but he's one study against thousands of others, and he swims against a tide of literally 89% of the studies show that everything goes in the other direction. He did a univariate analysis about secularity and how it relates to public benefits.
Sure, and I'm not saying that
he cherry-picked his results.
Oh, all right. Well, see, now we're in a different thing, because if we're going to start making accusations that his study's not wrong, or is not good because he cherry-picked it, I have problems with the other studies.
I'm not aware of the study, so could you just explain what's in the study, just so that
well, that's the thing. Without saying this isn't what I came in prepared to discuss, so I don't want to get the study wrong. The point I'm making is
you've been getting it wrong for 15 years.
I've been getting what wrong for 15 years? What his study says?
His study is a univariate analysis of how secularity within European countries is indexed to a whole different number of things like murder rates and that kind of thing. He didn't look at other things like crime rates and that sort of thing because it didn't help his analysis.
Sure,
so
you are pointing to problems that you have with his methodology, but that's not me getting wrong what his report says.
Why are you camping out on his study when literally there are thousands of studies that show the benefits of religion?
Well, I was getting to that a minute ago.
Okay.
Because a number of the things that in the studies that you would cite, I would also have a problem with their methodology. Because when you talk about, first of all, you've got the issue of self-reporting. How happy are you? And we know, for example, especially from ex-Mormons, that groups like Mormon culture encourage people to, because they are representatives of the church, to present themselves as happier when less problematic. Now, who knows what the actual truth is there? And I'm not saying what the truth is. What I'm saying is there's an issue with self-reporting. There's also an issue with what is the real foundation here? Is it that they are religious? Which, by the way, is independent from the truth of the religious proposition. That's why
So let's go and comment on this because I have a few things to say. I went and I looked at the study by Gregory S. Paul. Whoops, Craig, I think you're right near some traffic. I went and I looked at the study by Gregory S. Paul, and what it is, here's something that needs to be pointed out. It's very important. So one of the things that Glen Scrivener correctly pointed out is that it's a univariate study. I didn't know what sort of univariate study it was, so I looked at it and I found that I can't even believe that this study was published because it's based on simple correlations between two variables. So it looked at correlation between the secular state of a nation, or whether it's religious and has a belief in God, or whether people believe in evolution. And then it looked at a number of different variables, and it just did a one-on-one correlation to these other variables. So for example, it would correlate this idea of religiosity against another idea of accidents, or another idea of crime committed, or different sorts of things. So it was a one-on-one relationship. And it even noted in the study that they didn't use multiple regression. Any study worth its salt uses robust statistics, like at least multiple regression. That's the very baseline statistics that should be in academic studies. Using simple Pearson correlations is not a good, robust study. And the other issue with that is because, here's why it's not a robust study with Pearson correlations, is because there are other variables that impact these outcomes. You can't say that crime, for example, is necessarily correlated to, I mean, you could say it's correlated to some variables, but you have to enter in all of the other variables that have also impacted crime. For example, what are the levels of income in the country? What are the levels of inequality? What are the levels of politics? What are other factors that are important to this variable? So I'll explain why I know this is important. When I was in a PhD program years ago, I took a bunch of variables and I correlated them to foreign direct investment. And I went into one of my advisor's offices and I said to him that, hey, I've got this wonderful study. I'm able to show that high levels of individualism correspond to foreign direct investment. And he said, well, did I control for X, Y, and Z variables that also correspond quite highly with foreign direct investment? And I hadn't. And he said, well, then your findings are probably spurious. You have to include these other variables, or it might just be some effect that once you put the more important variables in, it would be weighed down. So what happened in that study was exactly like what Glen Scrivener said. There was some cherry picking going on. Did you guys want to comment on that?
I can. Converse, did you? Is he there?
Yeah, so Inspiring Philosophy actually made a video called Matt Dillahunty versus Science about this very topic, in which, I don't know how old it is, but I know it was right after they had a debate, that debate that we were talking about their last debate. And he criticizes the Gregory S. Paul paper that he brings up. One thing, I mean, I think you pretty much brought out most of what he said, but you put it in a different way according to your experience, because I know you are experienced in the field. But one thing that I thought was odd whenever I had checked out this paper was that it's written by the guy's a paleontologist. I'm not sure if that, I mean, I'm just wondering how that was related to the study of religious benefits or lack thereof. It was related to his field.
That's another point. That's a great point. And I think Glen Scrivener also made that point.
Yes, he did. He said,
Right. That's right.
he took like one or two, like not cheap shots, but like gotcha shots You've been you've been using that study for 15 years.
Yeah.
Let's be charitable and assume, yeah, it sounds like the methodology of that study is questionable, to say the least. But let's be charitable and assume that study is rock solid. Okay, even if it were, it's still one study out of a multitude of studies that are pointing to the opposite conclusion. Now, ultimately, I'm guessing if Matt Dillahunty involves himself in 2 or 3 more of these type of debates, he's already probably trying to find a way to calibrate his position better so that he can defend anti-theism in light of taking in this new information. See, the way that Aaron Rod does it is he doesn't take in the new information and he wins the debate by force of personality. He basically misdirects and overrides the other person. Matt doesn't do that. He has an actual conversation about the topic where the data gets, analyzed and discussed pretty much honestly. So ultimately he's going to have to yield, and he already has. So I don't know. We'll see what happens 2 years from now. But my guess is he's already trying to figure this out. If he's smart, he's already trying to get ahead of this curve, I think.
Yeah. So there's 2 more little things that I want to point out. Like, one is, so Jordan Peterson pointed this out in his famous Kathy Newman debate / interview, right? Because she was talking about women's issues and things like that, and he brought up that, like, yeah, men, and there's a wage gap if you do a univariate analysis, but like if you do a multivariate analysis and actually account for all the factors involved, like women having children and making different decisions, like, they'd rather see their daughter's piano recital than stay at the office all night and things like that, then it obviously changes, but based on decision making. But so I think that's a good point that he's making. But secondly, there is some room to be skeptical about studies, but you have to have a solid, because it seemed like Matt was trying to give an argument there, like that, well, Mormons, they might say that they're happy because they're part of the Mormon church or something like that. But like, that's not a solid thing to say. Like if I asked question a world survey on atheists, for example, like if you look up surveys, a lot of times it doesn't bring up atheists, it brings up non-religious. And that is totally different, right? So you could almost disguise that study to be like, well, no, on our side, we have 12% of the world's population. But then, like, if you get down to it, you're like, well, hold on a second. Well, non-religious people have 12%, but atheists are only about 2%.
Right, but that's exactly why no single study is relevant. It's the overall, right. What do all the studies collectively indicate? And it's really, really obvious that they indicate the sociological benefits of religion. It's pretty much a no-brainer. And the more you get, where Matt Dillahunty starts to make this debate move this debate more to friendly territory towards him, is he starts to move it towards, well, let's ask some questions, with speculative, philosophical questions. I admit that religion is useful, but is it true? And then he starts being, really good, and it's an interesting conversation. Yeah. But the debate is being won on the evidence.
And I think the last thing I just want to point out was, like, I was just thinking, like, I'm allowing Matt to come up with this and say, like, well, sure, but there's some other factor to it that the evidence might not be, like, portraying. But I'm saying, like, if you're going to say that, instead of like some innuendo or some like type of maybe scenario, I would want to give a something like what I just said about the non-religious versus atheists in surveys. Like, give some fact or something that is happening that can help us understand why you would disagree with the meta study or something like that.
Right. The other thing I want to point out is the variables. Matt is making an assumption that everything's subjective and it's based on self-reports. And people do have ways to test whether or not self-reports are biased. In fact, there's a test by a guy called Podzikoff that everyone uses if they wanted to determine whether or not any of their self-reported data are biased. And so there are statistical tests to control for that. And the other thing, just to point out as far as subjectivity, is a lot of the variables that were cited by Glenn were not subjective, I'm happy sort of variables. Instead, what they were was objective variables, such as people's donation rates, people's volunteer time. It's more that kind of information, or even things like suicides, very objective data. So Matt's claim that it's all subjective is something that is an overstatement, to say the least.
Yeah, totally.
So should we go on? You ready to listen to more?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right.
Challenge that I had for years was show me a real true benefit of religion that is necessarily only produced by the truth of that religion, because you can produce those same things with a compelling lie. If you've got 5 religions and only one of them is true, but all 5 of those people, religious individuals or people who are adherents to those are reporting that they're better and happier and these other things, then it has nothing to do with the truth of the religion. It has to do with who we are. And it may be the case that what people need is the community, which religions have done a really good job of building those communities. And it's one of the things that secular organizations are working towards doing now, building stronger communities. But we had to fight for just the right to exist and be open and talk about this before we could get to a point of building.
Comment on that?
Yeah, because I mentioned this last time when we were reviewing the Inspiring Philosophy debate with Matt. You see, Matt was saying, well, there may not be anything really about the religious part itself. It may just, it's that religion has done a really good job building communities and such, and that the community part of it. Well, the problem
it's just
is
some
that
coincidence from thin air.
Well, the problem is that the studies don't show religion makes lowers crime rates and stuff. It shows that intrinsic religiosity, the churches and community and stuff like that, is the extrinsic part of it. You see, that's what we mentioned last time. Like the extrinsic part is the community and the social environment and all of those things. That's so he's making the same mistake again by saying well, it may just be that they have, set up communities really well and things like that. When the truth is, no, it's not about that. That's the part that's the part that didn't show a positive correlation.
You're right. That's a great point. And just so the audience knows, intrinsic religiosity basically refers to your belief in God and your relationship with God. And it's more of an internal sort of thing. Extrinsic is what can I get out of the church? Whether it's I can get community out of the church, I can get these other external factors out of the church. So it's looking at like the JFK statement, what can my company, or ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, is similar to the idea of intrinsic is ask not what your church can do for you, but what you can do for God. And that's the bottom line. And so he's basically
also
erecting a straw man in a way.
Well, it also stands to reason because, anti-theists love to point to the negative scriptures, the controversial scriptures, but there's a whole bunch of other scriptures in the Bible. And if you have a community of people who are actually trying to embody the teachings of Jesus Christ in a way that's to be more loving, to be more compassionate, to be more merciful, to tend to the sick and the needy, and you're inundating them with those ideas, and be to one another, be more merciful, be more loving, be more compassionate, and they're praying to be better at that so they can be more Christ-like. It stands to reason that those are going to be a socially benevolent group of people. If you want a secular humanism to match it, you got to have to match the ideas and a delivery system that matches religion in terms of, get together every so often and plant these ideas deep into people so they can try to live them out. So, part of this is basic common sense. The studies are showing what's fairly obvious.
Yeah,
it's just
I agree.
that there's not really all that much real Christianity being practiced. You got a lot of crackpot Christians. But then, anyways, go ahead.
Or cultural Christians. People just sort of going to the
Christians,
church.
Or part of the problem Christians are probably the worst thing, because that's what the anti-theists cling to. The Christians who are, evil and just call themselves Christians and act terrible. They're the ones who really if you do a study on the Westboro Baptist Christians, I'm sure you're going to find religion's terrible because they're practicing this psycho version of it, But
that's part of the problem, because I was listening to Frank Turek. So I listened to him a lot, and I listened to a lot of his different debates where he's answering questions from people. And at the end of one of his debates, this woman stood up and she basically started going after him about his interpretation of the Sabbath. And he said that that's the one of the 10 commandments. That's the one that, Jesus fulfilled the law. Jesus fulfilled the 613 laws. And of the 10 commandments, 9 of them were essentially repeated in the New Testament. The one that was not repeated was the Sabbath. And Paul mentions in Colossians and other places that we don't have to follow the Sabbath as we did in the Old Testament. And so I'm bringing that up because this woman got in there, and she's one of those kind of Christians you're talking about that sort of knows it all. And she was basically going to tell him off because of his interpretation being wrong.
Right.
And
super religious and like really uptight and super religious and like, what's your problem? You're not helping. There was a guy that the other day, someone tweeted out, I forget, I joined the thread because a couple of people I knew had joined the thread, and the atheists were like beside themselves. Somebody said that if you don't hate atheists, you're not a real Christian, or something like that. Right. Something really psycho. And I said, like, great messaging, you're not helping. You're not helping at all. Thanks for the service, the preaching the gospel. Now be quiet, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask people, what did Jesus mean when he said, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart, but it wasn't that way from the beginning? And just see where they go with it. Oh, well, it was that specific law. Well, what about, okay, so the divorce law is that specific law. What about when he said, you've heard an eye for an eye, but tooth for a tooth? Oh, that law, that's, yeah, well, that's another example, but I'm like, where do you draw the line at? And I just see like where they go with it. I think it's interesting.
Well, that's what, and so here's what Matt's also going to do to build off what you're saying. He is also going to start talking about slavery in the Bible, because usually when atheists, in some cases, are losing these debates, they go over to the Old Testament and pull out those verses and say, well, God, he could have ruled that we shouldn't have slaves. And so he's going to do that. And Scrivener is going to point out that he's going to do that.
And then they start to win the debate, though, usually, because then you misdirect to the territory that favors. Matt's great at this, by the way. Misdirecting, totally setting the parameters of the debate so that he moves it on to the territory. He does it unconsciously. He does it really well. You barely pick it up that he's doing it, but he does it constantly.
Yeah. Right. So,
great
and one more thing on that is that when people say, well, yeah, you're picking and choosing. Well, chapter 21 is the part where it talks about Hebrew slaves and in the part that a lot of people like Skylar, for example, brings up. Well, it's just a few verses later where it talks about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Christ says, you've heard it said this, but I say this. So I just want to point out that sometimes people say, yeah, but that's unrelated to these other topics. But it's like, well, hold on a second, because he quotes directly from that chapter and says that that Moses, that's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was wrong. So I just want to say like those are related.
I agree. And the other thing is, just think about, no one wants to talk about how Paul referred to Onesimus in the New Testament. They don't want to talk about Jesus and the kind of things that he does. They don't talk about the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, since when are any of them even getting up there and saying, how would he the Sermon on the Mount? They don't want to talk about the good stuff. Totally.
I mean, then they say you're cherry picking, but it's absurd. You're cherry picking all the bad parts. You're digging into the esoteric, negative parts and pretending that's the whole message of the book. It's ridiculous,
Exactly.
And then I'm sure somebody right now is going Judges 14:6. But that's the nature of the game. But it's silly. To a certain degree, it's silly.
It is. All right, so let's go on. Here we go.
Those sorts of communities.
I mean, it's interesting. We've gone to this area of what is the value of religion, Christianity specifically, I suppose, in your case, Glenn. I mean, are you saying that the science seems to suggest that actually there's something about doing the things of religion, whether it be the community aspect, but also, I suppose, the ritual, the belief, the prayer, that is in some way we're kind of made for, in some way psychologically, that is our natural state, whereas you don't think that's the case with someone who adopts an atheist perspective on the world?
I think you can go there and you can make the argument that this seems to fit the human person better, therefore it might be more likely to be true. You could go there, but before you even go there, I think it's important that this difference between intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity is kind of
just explain what those two terms are.
So intrinsic religiosity is you don't treat religion like a means to an end. So your wife goes to church, and so you go to church too, just to keep her happy. That would be extrinsic religiosity.
Okay.
Or you like the community, or the pastor's not such a bad guy, and you guys go bowling on a Friday, and that's fine. That would be extrinsic religiosity. But the key question that would identify you as intrinsically religious would be, this is the most important thing to my life, or this is what helps me frame the rest of my decisions, or that kind of thing. And it's that seems to make the difference. So not just that you have community, but that you seem to be oriented towards something that is higher, something that is transcendent. That seems to give that added effect.
And I wouldn't even dispute that.
Okay.
We do some funny things with language when people are like, "Oh, you don't believe in anything higher than yourself?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by higher? Do you mean that not that I'm just basally selfish? Matt is the superior. There's nothing higher than Matt." No, because there are things that I value. There are things that I would sacrifice my time and energy for as well. There are folks who come, for example, to the atheist community of Austin, where this community has saved their lives. People who were suicidal, who were ostracized by family, who felt alone and everything else. And it has become essentially the most important thing to them. I think one of the differences is that I try to make sure that we're discouraging any sort of but I wouldn't deny or even object to the notion that the sorts of things that you're describing as religiosity are important to humans and may in fact be beneficial. My objection is to whether or not there's actually a truth behind that, an actual God thing. If it turns out I used to irritate some atheists because I would say, I can prove to you that prayer works, and I can demonstrate it right now. Because if you're in a cave-in and you pray, you are more likely to be rescued, not because there's some God listening to answer that, but because prayer has a calming effect on you, which extends the amount of time that you can be trapped, which extends the likelihood that you can be rescued. The question then becomes, if you know that it's the calming that extends the amount of time, could you do the same thing with meditation? Or does the awareness that it's the calming somehow eliminate the benefit of it? And that's the thing that I think we don't know.
I mean, are you interested in a sense, though, like the New Atheist Project to some extent, in deconverting?
Yeah.
See, this is what I'm talking about. That right there.
Yeah, you called it, Craig.
That's 100 times more reasonable version of Matt Dillahunty. I don't object to anything he said in that little slice. He said there is value to religion. There's trying to experience the transcendent. Prayer can actually have beneficial effects, at the very least a physiological effect where you're like, you can use it to calm yourself. I've talked about that in my videos where like my mother-in-law was on death's door and I was the only one that was able to stay sane in the crisis because I had a connection to a strong prayer life that kept me grounded and peaceful while everyone else was falling apart emotionally. So just on that level, it's obviously beneficial and it can be proven to be beneficial. So he's speaking the truth there. And that's what I'm saying. Ultimately, he's going to have to yield to the truth maybe not. And then he shifts it to, but God still doesn't exist. But I'm totally cool if he wants to still say God doesn't exist, but I'll give you 80% of the argument, but I'm just not going to believe. I'm fine with that.
You're right about that. But whenever I heard him say that, like, well, I'm fine with religious things, being something that humans can use or need, or so. I was like, oh, Craig called it. But one thing I did want to point out is watch Matt's experience when Scrivener gives the explanation of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, and basically Matt realizes, oh, it's not the sense of community. Watch how he does. He goes, oh no, I can totally agree with that. But then he goes over into, but it's like we can do funny things with language. For example, if somebody asks, he doesn't say, for example, he just says, we can do funny things with language, like when somebody asks me, so there's nothing higher than yourself? And I go, well, there's plenty of things that I'll stand up for and things. It's like, I don't see how any of that had to do with what we're talking about. But then he goes back into, so I could say that religious people, there might be something that could help them along the way or something. But it's like, it just seemed like he did a pretty like tight maneuver to get from I agree with you to yeah, but it may not be correct. But in between there was like this little phrase that he used where he's like, yeah, but think about like when people ask me about so there's nothing higher to you or something, you know. And I just found it as I just noticed it as a tactic, and I thought, well, that's probably from his experience, you know.
I think it was, and I think he wanted to segue into a topic that he's more comfortable with because he realized that this isn't the one he's going to win.
Right, and they even pull him back at one point in this debate. I think it's the moderator who goes, well, this isn't the topic, because I think that's where he pulls it into slavery in the Old Testament, and he pulls it back to. But yeah, I mean, he does it so well that you barely catch it. And I don't think he's doing it necessarily consciously. He just maneuvers really deftly, you know, in debate situations, and he maneuvers really well into territory that he's more familiar with and better at. Easily, like you barely perceive him doing it. It's not awkward at all. It's like, it's really impressive, actually.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention something with the prayer studies. That's one thing that a lot of atheists like to go with is the prayer studies, and they point to this gigantic one by the Templeton Foundation. And one of the reasons why that study didn't work is because they couldn't control in no way for the prayers of loved ones for people who were going through surgery. So they had a bunch of people going through surgery, and they had a couple of control groups. One was not being prayed for and the other one was being prayed for. And interestingly, the people who were praying for them didn't even, it was among those people was a very liberal group of people who didn't even believe in Jesus's resurrection necessarily. And so we have that kind of person praying for them from afar. They've never met them, don't know their anything really about the people they're praying for. And you couldn't control for the loved ones of people who were in the control group where they didn't have the prayers coming in from this group from afar. So
yeah, I seen your video on that. That was interesting. And like most of the prayer groups were Catholics, for example. I believe that was one of them.
One of them was Catholic, and another one was this group of people who were I forget what they're called, but they're basically spiritual more than Christian.
Yeah, and so I thought I watched your video and I thought that was pretty well done. So that was informative. And see, that's what I'm talking about earlier when I'm like, well, sure, you can challenge one of these studies, but just have some type of like something I can sink my teeth into to look into and go, oh, okay. Not just like
maybe the methodology wasn't quite right for the conclusion they drew. Sure. Like the thing that Matt Dillahunty talked about is a basic. You don't even need the study to understand that prayer can calm you and give you peace, and add some scriptures that, like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me into a trial situation, and you can easily understand how that could really help you overcome difficult circumstance. I mean, it's not rocket science.
Agreed. Yeah. And it even studies of brain studies, they've looked at how our brains are wired, and they found that prayer and meditation is helpful for our brains. So it's in alignment with the way God made us. All right. So you ready to move on? We'll go to the next part. Here we go.
People, getting them out of those beliefs. And if you do, do you run the danger of actually creating a worse kind of life for them, because actually they may not make that transition into a secular version of the well-being that religion may have given them up to that point? I mean, it can be quite a really harsh process, deconverting. It can be terrible.
And one of the things that we see undeniably within some people who leave religion, who identify as atheists, is they often fall into nihilistic kind of, I wouldn't say often, occasionally fall into. Some of us don't have any issue with that at all. And so that it's not I'd never pretend that there's no problems or anything else. First of all, I don't go door to door. Hey, have you stopped believing in Jesus yet? I can fix that. We take incoming calls, so we're having conversations with the people that want to.
Yeah.
And I think that if all we're doing is actually questioning the reasoning behind a belief, in the same way that truth is always a defense to slander, that's what we're engaged in. How much responsibility, if somebody gives up their religion because of what I said, and they have negative consequences because of that, how much of that am I responsible for? This is something that I've considered quite a bit. What I find is that the people who end up suffering the negative consequences, the core problem there still goes back to religion. It's like if somebody told you when you're 30 you're going to inherit $1 billion, and you get to be 30 and you find out you're wrong. Now your life may be crap from that point on, because you may have lived as if you were going to inherit $1 billion and you didn't. You may have built up expectations and changed your fundamental perspective on the world, so that once it's not true, you're now miserable, maybe you're bankrupt and everything else. But it's not learning that you did not inherit $1 billion that was the problem. It was the false promise of $1 billion at the beginning that was the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from your perspective as well as a Christian, Glenn, you don't want people to be Christians just because of the benefits it brings in terms of, the community and the lifestyle and the psychological well-being. So you're interested in truth as well, just
Absolutely.
as much as Matt.
Yeah.
What if we found out the happiest way to be was just to be high on heroin all the time?
Right.
We do know there's
rat in a cage with
we do know there's big negative consequences that long term, so I don't think that's likely as a possibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it needs to be existentially grounded. I think it needs to be true in order to live out that life. Because, I mean, life is a wager. I am constantly, I don't mean this in the religious sense at all. Life is an act of faith. I step out into the world not knowing what's going to hit me. Am I going to open myself out to the world in a certain way that will make me vulnerable, that will make me weak, that could get me attacked, but in another sense, it could help people. All of life is a venture of faith. And if it's not true, then I'm a fool, and I think,
He's kind of alluding a little bit to Pascal's wager here. Do you feel like that? You guys see a little bit of that? So it's kind of the idea is if you live your life, if two people live their lives, one's a believer and one's a non-believer, Pascal basically says that it's in your best interest to be a believer because you'll end up going to heaven. And so if you're a non-believer, the consequences can be pretty thick if what we're saying is true.
Yes, I see that. It's like a really, really highbrow version of it, though, of like much better than actually Pascal's wager, but it's the same idea. It's like there's some consequence to not believing. That's much bigger. I don't know exactly how he phrased it. I'm walking back home. My wife left, so I was in the woods. That's why I have it. Can you see the?
I can see you. Well, I can see you. Yeah, I can see the beach. It's a nice view. Really nice view. That's just not fair,
That's
Craig.
Surfrider Beach. That's Surfrider Beach.
That is nice.
Awesome.
I don't know how the camera's working. The camera's on me, so you can probably see the pier now, right?
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah,
calm
cool.
day too. It looks like calm as glass
Yeah,
out
it's
there.
beautiful. All right, I'll cut the camera. I'm
Yeah,
going
that's
back
awesome.
home. So my wife was in the apartment. That's why I was in the woods.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I would say, honestly, I'm not a big fan of Pascal's wager as an argument for Christianity. I do think if you're just trying to say, like, listen, the stakes are high, then I agree with it. And I think, yeah, that's true. And it's a good point. But I don't
Hey,
think
wait,
anybody.
Craig, you're clicking. There's some clicking noise. Sorry, just want to.
Yeah. So I don't think anybody should believe something because something like you're going to wager something. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't want to I would want to believe something because it's true. I wouldn't want to believe it just because, like, well, what if you didn't believe it and something were to happen? It's like, I'm not going to wager my beliefs on something like that. But if the point is, well, hey, look, the stakes are high. So, like, what happens if I get that. Like, that makes sense to me. I just would rather believe it because of, the character of Christ or, some other reason, and then use Pascal's wager as like something like refreshing to think about, like, well, yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of at stake with the beliefs that I did take, for example.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of alluding to a little bit here is this idea of the carrot and the stick. And I've heard a lot of apologists go around and they start using the stick a lot. They're like, you're going to go to hell. Do you really want to go to hell? You're burning in hell. I think now that's just to me, that's an awful approach. I just don't think it's effective. And I also don't think the carrot's necessarily effective, saying you're going to go to heaven. It's all about heaven, because that's not really what it's about. It's not about these extrinsic motivations. Like you and I have talked about before, Converse, it's about the intrinsic self-actualization and that sort of thing. Those are the reasons why people should believe for intrinsic religiosity or intrinsic reasons. So you believe because it's part of your very being and your existence. All right, so here we go.
Christianity is a venture to be in Jesus and with Jesus, extending my arms out to the world the same way that he was in sacrificial love, if God is not on the other side of that, raising me up again, which is the Easter story, cross and resurrection, then I am to be pitied more than all men, which is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So I absolutely believe that we have common cause on this one. It must be true, but if it is true, I think that is what explains its workability.
Right.
There are some people, I've done debates online with people who are very much atheists in the mold of Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson, and
who see the usefulness of religion.
Right. It's metaphorically true. So which is true enough. And really, the debates we seem to have had, they seem to have been saying, well, to live this way, i.e. in this moral way, works, therefore it's true. And I kept on saying, well, no, I think it's true, and therefore it works.
Right.
And I think that's where I come to with that brand of atheist. I do think you need to ground it in what is actually true about the world. But I think an inference to the best explanation for why it is that religion actually does work in the world is that it is true.
I mean, Matt says that you need to give secular humanism a chance. It hasn't had a long time to actually get going and create community, and potentially you will see all the same benefits accrue to someone who simply says, well, that's my way of finding meaning in the world. I don't have to have
I don't know if I'd say.
Oh, maybe you wouldn't. Well, what would you say?
I come pretty close.
Okay.
So one of the things is when Jordan Peterson and I sat down, I pointed out that there's never been a secular humanist government, and he tried to say that the Soviet Union was, and he just doesn't understand what secular human is. That wasn't secular humanism. That was basically state-enforced atheism, and was very much anti-religion. And so if we're going to use the language, we can certainly separate the types of things that we would put in a bucket as religiosity. Maybe it's a sense of awe. Atheists can have a sense of awe. Maybe it's the notion that there's something that may be greater than the self that you might want to consider yourself with. I think so. I think there are concepts, truth and freedom. I think that, the society that I benefit, that I'm also a part of, needs to be considered. You can't be myopic when you're looking at something like well-being and just say, well, this benefits me. Who cares what it does to anybody else? Because we're intertwined. But there were a couple, to kind of go back to something that Glenn mentioned, I would agree that if there were a God, we'll stick with a Christian God so that we don't have to drag everybody else into it today. But if there were a God, that would be a sufficient explanation for why some of these devout religious tendencies seem to be beneficial to the practitioner. In the same way that if...
Yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe I'll just make like a little brief point and then we can move. I mean, something he said there that, so I'm taking an ethics course right now, Philosophy 110 Ethics. And so I've been thinking a lot about ethical situations right now, consequentialism, and like I took a deontological view, for example. And also I've put out a response to Apologia's Christian morals, that. And I talked with, because he just put out a video the other day about it again, saying that, oh, nobody's really answered it. So I put out, so when I had Ask Yourself on last night, he's a real like philosophical, logical guy. And so we had evaluated it, and we reevaluated it last night just to, and he said like, well, sure, unless he reformulates it, your critique still stands. And but what Matt just said is related, because Matt just said when we're looking at well-being, you can't be myopic and look at one thing, right? The problem with that is, like he says, because you're only thinking about yourself. The problem with that is, well, then how do we, on a consequentialist view like that, how do we avoid utilitarianism and going, well, if I kill 5 people, I can save 150 people. So we should kill those 5 people. Well, how do you avoid that? Because a myopic view would be like, well, no, those 5 people are my friends, and like you're worried about like your people. Like he said, you can't do that because you're worried about yourself. You can't be myopic when it comes to this consequentialist view of well-being. And I just think,
I want to build on what you're saying too. I'm really great points.
Yeah. And so my thing with Apologia is like the only response I got. So basically his thing was, Can you name something that on biblical morality that wouldn't fit into the well-being category that most people would generally think is a moral thing? And I said, sure. The claim in the Bible that to give your life for someone else is a great good. And
that's what I said when I responded to him too. That's exactly what I said.
Did you really?
Yeah.
I haven't seen your video. You used the same verse as me?
I don't know if I use the same verse, but I basically said what Jesus said. He laid down his life for another, and that's something that goes right against survival.
Well, that's interesting. That is super interesting. Yeah. So I have to check out your video on it because I knew that you had made a response because you mentioned it to me, but I'll have to check that out. Well, anyway,
I said the same thing actually.
Did you really?
Not in my video. I think I said it somewhere on the tweet. So I think I tweeted it to him.
So
go ahead.
But here's the last thing I was gonna say about that is his only response to me was that, well, yeah, but that's basically self-sacrifice. And it used as a general principle, it could be applied to a larger group, like one person giving their life for multiple people or something like that. It can be applied, and self-sacrifice can be a good thing for communities or, things like that. But it's like, but that's not the question. You're asking for a moral thing. So I give you an instance. Like when I'm reading my ethics book, for example, it looks at instances and it says, well, here's an instance of a baby who has this disorder, and would this be moral or would this be moral to do? And you're looking at instances, and after Ask Yourself and I responded, we never heard anything back. And then, like I say, the other day when he made that video, I just thought, and he said none of the responses have worked, and I was just like, okay.
Yeah, he just ignores. He just ignores. Well, I want to build on what you're saying, because I think people might not realize what you're talking about in case they're not familiar with some of the words that you used. So you're talking about, a lot of people look at objective morality and they try to figure out how to explain certain actions. And what they do is they might say, okay, I'm going to endorse this idea of consequentialism, which is the greatest good. We're going to try to maximize the greatest good and the consequence. Or there's this idea of utilitarian that basically says you want to do what's best for the most people. And the problem with that particular view is when people do this trolley dilemma and they choose either utilitarian responses or they choose deontological responses. The utilitarian response on the trolley dilemma is if there's 4 people on a train track and a train is approaching them, and you have the opportunity to push somebody in front of those people, and that somebody will die that you push, but the 4 people will be saved. Utilitarianism would say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and push this person to save the 4. And the deontological person would say, I'm not going to do any harm. The deontological is focused on a moral duty. And so the interesting thing is utilitarianism corresponds to psychopathy. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of communists would use that and say well, sure, we have to, kill 2 million Ukrainians, but we'll save millions, way more millions than the people we kill, for example. It's just, and the deontological view is
right. It's easy to say the ends justify the means,
right?
And then be totally immoral. That's actually a good point, because a lot of the biggest ideologues in history were genuine idealists, and then they sort of morphed that into psychopaths, in building their perfect world.
And I'm actually glad we're sitting here doing this, because when I originally watched this, I watched it when it was live, and I didn't recognize him saying that. But it may be because I was on the move and I was just listening to it, but I didn't even hear him say that. We can't look at myopic examples when you're talking about well-being. And I was just thinking, when I heard that, I was like, okay, wait a second, because here's an interesting point.
Well, let's go back to why he says well-being. So what Matt is doing right there is he's trying to say the consequence that we supposedly all share, that we want to maximize well-being, or we want to maximize care and minimize harm. That's the bottom line, that people who agree that we have objective morality, they try to ground it in that. So what they try to do is say that the source of our objective morality is the consequence we all share and desire. And you can't ground a source in a consequence. It's circular reasoning. And so it's something that doesn't work, although they haven't really thought that through, but some scholars have thought that through, and that's basically what they say. It's circular reasoning, sourcing the source of the, it's like looking at an independent variable and a dependent variable, and then just saying, okay, they're the same. It doesn't make sense. So, all right, you guys ready to go on? because so everybody listen to when he mentions well-being, and again, remember that this is the consequence that he's saying we all desire. Now, he is making a claim that everyone desires well-being and the maximization of well-being, and he's also not focusing on how people might believe that they can maximize their own well-being through harming other people. So some of this is a personal, subjective opinion of his on a consequence. So here we go.
If there were a God, that would explain some of the things that creationists point to with regard to design. My concerns on these are separate. Yes, of course, that would be sufficient. But is it actually true? Because we've done this over and over again, where we make an inference to an explanation based on whatever limited knowledge and information we have right now. And then we find out later we got it wrong. And every time we found out later that we got it wrong, it was scientific exploration and discovery that found out it was wrong. And at no point have we ever found out we were wrong about a God.
What do you make of that, Glenn?
Is secular humanism new? In one sense, yes, quite new. In another sense, I think it's a repackaging of Christianity light. I do think Nietzsche's critique holds that secular humanism tends to be Christianity where God is swapped out for the good.
But to the extent that's true, couldn't we just say that Christianity is the Hammurabic code swapped out or upgraded or changed, or that all of this is derivative? At some point, we're talking about human beings and how they choose to try to answer the questions and live lives cooperatively. Whether you're going back to animism and some tribal struggle, then this becomes a more codified sort of language. And when people aren't paying attention to it and the village elder is no longer a sufficient authority, we appeal to one outside of there. I mean, this would also be a sufficient explanation for the history of religion. So to say that...
So he's pointing out something that has been found in some academic studies. So there are some academic studies that have basically said that they've theorized on why people decided to, in some cases, invent gods, or in other cases, believe in God. And it's because there's external accountability. And the theory goes that as the villages got bigger and you weren't necessarily held accountable in your village because it had gotten so big, then they're bringing in their own external person to whom we're all accountable. And so that's the claim of some atheists, if they try to say that everything's explained by the social sociality and that kind of thing. But one other thing that Matt is doing that I don't think he realizes, or that other people are doing sometimes, is pointing to the benefits of Christianity. Because Christianity has changed fundamentally the way society's operated. Before, the strong were always revered. And when people were blind or if they had any sort of disabilities, people assumed that they were being punished by the gods. And the weak were not cherished at all, and the weak weren't helped at all. And so when Jesus came around, he did something that was completely against the way that those societies were operating. He said, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are the humble, that sort of thing. And so he completely flipped the script on how people used to treat others and how they elevated the rich and they kept the poor put down. And how they treated human lives, marching people out in the Colosseum and doing things like that.
Totally. And he pointed this out somewhere else in this particular debate. And it was a great point. And what Matt Dillahunty is calling secular humanism, he says that's kind of a version of Christianity light. And it's totally true. Because the same thing with Sam Harris. They both have this universalist ethos where we're all the brotherhood of man and even the least of us is worthy of love and respect. But they don't realize that comes directly out of Christianity. And what he's arguing here and Tom Holland argues is prior to Christianity, and this is actually, as far as I'm concerned, this is a really strong argument, or at least a compelling one. Prior to Christianity, there was no such idea as in the Old Testament, you have everyone is created in the image of God, giving you an actual scriptural predicate that everybody has.
Sorry about that.
Intrinsic value. And then you have your fulfillment in Jesus, where he says, that what you've done unto the least of my children, you've done to me, which means the homeless guy is part of humanity too. Prior to that, the homeless guy was who cared, so.
Exactly. Women, babies were left out on the streets. I mean, people just did not value life back then. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, well, then you're talking about valuing life and people didn't value life. When we say you have objective morality, and one of the objective moral values is the value of life. And it's something that we've even codified across the planet in the United Nations and in different places and in governments is talking about the value of life. And so when he's going to talk about slavery and go back to the Old Testament, he's trying to say that people's values were different. It's to have the objective value of value in life is something that stays the same. It's like a football stadium with the touchdown pole. Basically, it stays the same, but people's alignment towards those values, that's what changes over time. And so people had different practices back in there. And as we discover our values and we discover our moral duties, society gets better and better and better. And so that's basically what we've been seeing in social evolution too.
So one thing I want to point out is right before that, Matt was talking about, he said something like, well, when we make decisions based on limited knowledge and then we find out that it was wrong, science updates that or whatever. But I want to point out, like, there is, like, I told you I'm in a philosophy course, and like one thing that, I'm learning about right now is heuristic models, right? There's a heuristic model, I think it's called referential heuristics. And basically it's like you reference things, you go based off of what references you know. So like if I'll give you an example. There was a study done that people in Chicago was asked, like, what city has a bigger population? Is it San Diego or is it San Antonio? Like, who's got the more dense population? And they did that in Germany at a university, and they did it at the University of Chicago, I believe it was. And the University of Chicago, 62% of people said that it was San Diego and got it right. In Germany, 100% of the people got it right. Well, you might be like, well, hold on a second. How did Germans know more about our American cities than Americans? Well, they don't actually. The thing is that when you ask them about a city, like if I were to ask you right now, there's some city in Germany called Berkshire, right? It's be pronounced different, like Berkshire or something. But then I would say, or Berlin, which one is the most densely populated city? Well, you're familiar with Berlin, right? Like,
so you guess Berlin.
Right. You would say, well, it's got to be Berlin because it's the one I've heard of. Like if the other one was bigger, I would have probably heard of it. And so there are heuristic models that even with limited knowledge, you can use what knowledge you have and still come out correct. So I just wanted to point out, like, it's not always the case that you will have 100% scientific evidence on something. Like, you got to use what you have at a certain point. And so I don't know exactly what he was trying to get at with that, but it sounded like he was saying,
scientists use intuition and they take educated guesses. That's how they decide, let's do this set of experiments versus this set of experiments. That's how they become successful scientists, because they use, hunches and intuitions and educated guesses. I don't know if that's exactly what you meant, but as a general rule, the atheist community downplays that type of intuitive process in favor of rationality and analytics and logic, which has its place. But
I also want to add, just in case people don't know what Converse Contender was talking about with heuristics, the idea of heuristics is shortcuts. And so through life, through evolution, through just preparing ourselves and trying to be safe in the land, if you want to say that, we've developed shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts, because we don't have the cognitive capacity to think into every single encounter that we have. We know, for example, that snakes are dangerous. We might have decided that at one point in our life, and that carries through forever. And so anytime you see a snake, you think to yourself, okay, snakes are dangerous because I've got that shortcut, that sort of thing that's in my mind from the past. So I'm building on that reference. And so those are some good points. I want to add something that's really interesting that Matt didn't talk about that I think is kind of related. He says every time we don't know about something, suddenly there's a scientific discovery. And I'd like to add, or an archaeological or geological discovery. And for example, if we go back and we say in the 1800s, a lot of people in Germany were theorizing that the Old Testament and the New Testament had been corrupted quite a bit. And then what happened is in the 1940s, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls and discovered that no, they weren't corrupted. In fact, everything's pretty much the same in the Dead Sea Scrolls as in the Old Testament. And so I think that the archaeology, as Jesus pointed out, if people keep silent, the stones will cry out. And we keep year after year finding information that's refuting a lot of the points that people are trying to make about the Bible.
Checkmate, atheist. Do you hear that? Checkmate. And if that doesn't work, kalam.
That's their favorite argument, is a kalam. That's so funny. Okay, here we go.
Secular humanism is a newly packaged, light, modified version of Christianity. Really isn't relevant if Christianity is a modified version of other things that all tie back to the human being.
Which is a big if, and I don't think it is at all. I think what you get when you look at human civilizations, what you get when you look at the Hammurabi Code, or when you look at the Enuma Elish, when you look at any number of the ancient Near Eastern texts, when you look at any number of Greco-Roman understandings of the world, or Persian understanding of the world, or Muslim understanding of the world, it is basically that in the realm of the flesh, in the realm of biological reality, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore sacrifice of the weakest. And I think what you get absolutely uniquely in Christianity is the reverse of that. You have in Christ the fittest who is sacrificed for the survival of the weakest.
Brilliant.
And what you get birthed out of the Christian movement is a unique preference for the poor, the marginalized, the weak, the outsider, to draw them in, such that obviously in every society there's tit for tat, and there's let's cooperate and let's do all that kind of stuff. But who is we in that sentence? Let us cooperate. Well, who's the us? It could be just you and me and not Justin, or it could be just me and Justin and not you, right? Who are the people on planet Earth who are actually saying it's actually all of us, even our enemies, are those who we include in the circle of humanity, and who we grant equal human dignity to, and who we say they must never be marginalized, no matter how weak they are, no matter how ineffectual they are, no matter how maladapted to survival they are ours, and we will grant them a universal human dignity. That's a thoroughly Christian idea. And it's not,
That's
it's
totally
obviously
brilliant.
it's found on the first page of the Bible, so it's there in Judaism, but it is a uniquely Christian idea that I think secular humanism has taken on. But I don't think you derive that secular humanism anywhere else but in Christianity.
And Judaism.
Let's call it the Judeo-Christian worldview,
Sure.
or whatever.
Let's credit the Abrahamic God with everything. And when I look at it, my issue is,
Okay, should we make predictions? Is he going to go and start talking about slavery yet?
I think he shifts. Yeah, I think this is because that right there, I thought that was absolutely brilliant. That's
I
a
did
brilliant, brilliant summation of Christianity, and it underscores what I was talking about. It starts in the Old Testament. Everyone poo-poos the Old Testament. God's so mean in the Old Testament. But the idea that the outsider is part of the collective us, everybody's one of us. That's I think that's unique to Judaic tradition. I really do. Might not be, but then it finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say I have a different. I mean, not different from you. I have an interesting take on this whole thing. But I guess I'll just wait till he brings up slavery, and then maybe I'll say something.
I want to mention the Code of Hammurabi because I have Jesse Camping in the audience, and I listened to a video that Jesse Camping made, and I'm going to have him on my channel pretty soon. We're trying to work out a date, but Jesse Camping did a video on the Code of Hammurabi and talking about that. And there was big distinctions back then. If you were wealthy, you were given great treatment. You weren't punished the same. The retribution was different than if you were poor. And so that's essentially, we're saying that everyone should be punished equally for the same offenses. And in the Code of Hammurabi, you would get different punishment depending on what your level of society was. So that's another place that Christianity did us right, is basically
Right.
giving every individual
Christianity
rights.
was a radical upending of social norms in terms of the rich and the powerful were important and everybody else was irrelevant, to the point where you could, you didn't have to care at all about them. And it starts in, everyone is created in the image of God. So that's implicit. Everybody is of equal value in the sight of the Lord. That's implicit about how you structure your society. All of a sudden, everybody's important, not just the people who are the rich and the powerful. Then Jesus is total upending. Is Jesse Camp an atheist or a Christian?
No, Christian.
Oh, okay. I think he commented on my video, and I wasn't aware who he was, so I thought might have been an atheist. I wasn't sure.
Yeah. So this was an interesting approach. I agree with both of you guys. Glenn is made a great move there. I think he was really able to underscore a lot of the points of Christianity. And even look at Justin Brierley. Look how happy he looks right now on the screen. He looks pumped up that he brought Glenn on. I can say that. So here we go. Let's listen to some more. Let's hear him get to slavery.
If there is an Abrahamic God, okay, that's an important question, which I guess we're going to somewhat sideline, because at the end of the day, this notion that human beings who care about human beings are not going to come up with multiple different ways of structuring a society, and that some of those, which may be consistent with your view and understanding of Christianity, which I would argue is perhaps different than some other people's view and understanding of Christianity. I don't think that's particularly contentious at this point. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that this is Christianity light and modified and updated, or that it's all derived from Christianity as the original source, because that presumes that there's something other than human beings that are the original source for those ideas. The fact that they became popular within Christianity, you know, that you have somebody talking about blessed are the meek, did that ultimately lead some people to the United Nations Universal Code of Human Ethics type stuff and secular humanism? Sure. Because we're all together on a planet and these ideas get passed around. And my take on it has always been, take the best ideas wherever you find them, get rid of the rest. And so from, you know, the Bible, I can pull out some really good ideas and I can get rid of its support for slavery or genocide or misogyny or any of those things. I don't have to hang on to the baggage or claim that I'm doing it because there's...
So here we go. He said it. Did you hear it?
Slavery.
He just slipped in misogyny, slips in all those stuff. Of course, no one mentions that a lot of the people in the Old Testament times voluntarily gave themselves into slavery. People don't mention the fact that the owners were told to take care of their slaves, to feed them, to provide shelter for them. In a lot of cases, people as slaves could do better than if they were actually out there trying to fend for themselves. So there was and if they ran away, if they didn't like the relationship, they were to run away, and the Israelites were to house them and keep them safe if people ran away from their slave owner. And that just tells you that's completely different from antebellum slavery.
Yeah, Craig, you want to say something before I go ahead?
No, I think you can go.
Okay. So like I like so with the topics like this, you know, I like to go back to the words of Christ where he says, where people said, well, Moses said that we could divorce our wives. And he says, well, like the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, where he goes, well, you've heard it said that, but I say it's not so, or whatever. And then you have like, well, Moses said we could divorce our wives. And he says, well, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart, because you, but it hasn't been that way from the beginning. And basically what I take that to mean is that like Moses gave you certain laws because you are a barbaric people. So for example, there's a principle in the Bible that says like people are give babes milk until they're able to eat meat, right? Or solid food, right? It says solid food, I think. So that principle though, I think goes on here as well, because if you try to go to somebody, let's say that there's this deontological standard, you were to try to go to somebody who has always lived as if that the opposite of that, and you're going to say like, well, you have to change today. Like I think that what God's doing is he's shaping people over the time by regulate, like everything you find in the Bible about slavery is all regulations. And so I think what God's doing is limiting their evil and saying until they get to a certain point where the hardness of their heart had dissipated, like and there are other verses that support this, but to not be too long-winded, like but by the time you get to the New Testament, you have, for example, things like in Timothy 1, where it says, where First Timothy says, we know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and the rebellious and the ungodly and the sinful and the unholy and the irregular religious, and for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for the murderers, sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, and for slave traders and liars and perjurers. Slave traders are listed with all of the like perjurers and liars and so on and so forth. Slave traders are listed there. That tells you one thing, that like that's obviously not a good thing, right? And then like you mentioned earlier, like the book of Philemon, Paul says, I found your runaway slave Onesimus, take him back, Philemon, no longer as a slave though, right? And so there are a lot of these principles, but then people like will always go, well, hang on a second, because the New Testament says slaves obey your masters, right? Like completely out of context, of course, but like think about it. When we look at an example from the New Testament, like of Christ talking about slaves, let's just give you an example from Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the talents. It says that one was paid, they were all paid different talents of gold according to their skill level, and it calls them slaves. You know, one thing this tells us is that they were getting paid for their labor, right? Even though it still uses the same word for slave there. I think that a lot of people, when they hear obey your masters to the servants, like that, it's talking about like modern day American or the transatlantic slave trade. It's not thinking that it's saying like, hey, you know, that these people are getting paid for this, for example. I think that that's more the context, what the example that Christ actually gave, where he says that one was paid this and one was paid that. They all got paid according to their wages. I mean, according to their skill level. And so that's just a little point I wanted to point out there, is that when atheists do what Matt does here and try to shift over from, well, yeah, but then we're discounting slavery in the Bible and blah, blah, blah. Like they say it and then move on. But it's like, well, hold on a second, because you're assuming that the Bible's talking about what you're assuming slavery to be. You know what I mean? And that it's saying that it's a good thing rather than regulating it and then eventually moving away from it, like in the New Testament, for example.
I want to bring out that kind of relates to the idea of embarrassing testimony, because in the Old Testament, we do see a lot of really ugly things that happened in history. And the authors wanted to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. They didn't want to exclude anything. As Matt said, he'd pull the slavery stuff out. Well, that's pulling out a chapter of history. And so you can't just pull the slave part out because you don't like it and it makes your feels feel bad. But the other thing that he mentioned with misogyny as something that needs to be addressed too, because Jesus elevated Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene and the other women were the first to discover the empty tomb. He, in many cases, all throughout the New Testament, Jesus was elevating women. And right now in Christian societies, Western countries, women have equal rights. Women have been given a lot of these kind of rights because of our Christian values.
I'll say two things. The argument that he just made about slavery, the first part of what you said, that's about the best possible defense, if you work on that, of slavery in the Old Testament. That's the only one that I can see actually winning some of these debates, where how you kind of implying it's something like, what you said at the beginning.
Yeah, that Christ said, "Hey, listen, this is because of the hardness of your heart that Moses gave you certain laws."
That's the best. Work that out well, and that is the strongest possible defense of why there's slavery in the Old Testament, why slavery exists in the Bible. That's an actual one that can work if you're still trying to say like the Bible doesn't have errors, and here's how you justify that. That what you just said will work.
Yeah, because it seems like to me, like if I were going to go to like my friend who's a drug addict, if my standard is it's wrong to do drugs, but I know that if I make him stop doing drugs tonight, he could die in the morning. Like I'm not going to make him stop doing drugs tonight because I don't want him to die. Like, but if there's a way to like get him methadone or some other thing that can start to move him away from that until he's at a point where he can't, that he can actually do what the standard is, now I can say, well, listen, now that you're clean, like you have to follow, like this is the standard you have to follow.
Right.
Yeah. And if you go back into that, you're lost again. Like, so.
Right. And then, it's Paul. I gave you milk because you weren't ready for solid food. That's him talking to other Christians. Like I'm giving you gentle, easy to understand teachings because you can't digest the real meat of the gospel. That's what I think he meant in that particular. But that's the best possible argument to justify slavery in the Bible. It's still gonna be hard to defend, but it's the best possible defense that you could offer.
Yeah, I like the idea that you went to 1 Timothy and you found slave traders listed there with all the other bad people. So I think that's wonderful. I never even knew about that passage, or maybe if I read it, I just read right over it. So
the other thing I was going to point out real quick is that what Matt Dillahunty does, and this is how he shifts the parameters of the debate, because this particular person does not take the bait, but you guys are already starting to. It's a really, really awesome tactic. Couple people I know do it. You say inflammatory things. I don't know that Matt Dillahunty is doing it like on purpose. I think he actually believes that the Bible's full of misogyny and endorses slavery and all that. I believe he's sincere in that. But you pepper the honest conversation with inflammatory things that get the person to jump on the inflammatory thing. Then you're winning the debate, because their emotions are engaged in a way that's not going to help them. Whereas you're sticking to like, it's how my wife wins every argument. She says inflammatory things and she peppers it into like the truth. And then I start getting like, and she wins the debate.
Yeah,
She
that's a
stays calm
good
and kills
point.
me.
That's a good point, because I think you might be right about that. Like, it's almost like a red herring to draw
It's
him
totally a
away
red
from the
herring.
argument.
Matt Dillahunty does it so subtly. You know, here the Bible's full of misogyny. The Bible's full of, you know, hate and slavery. What good Christian apologist can resist going, no, it's not. Let me defend. All of a sudden you're on territory where he's going to win.
And it
You've
seems
moved.
like, yeah, it seems like that's actually like a young Earth creationist view, tactic as well, because, like, not saying that there's anything wrong with that view. I'm just saying, like, a lot of the people who take that view seem to like when you're debating about evolution or something, not all, some of them have like a really solid argument like that they've worked on. But like some of them, like when they're talking about evolution, different like things about mechanisms and all, they'll say something like, so, but yeah, but you believe our grandfather was a banana or something like that, you know, to kind of like throw out that thing so that he can chase that down and go, well, hold on a second. No, because plants, blah, 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 and then go into all the little details and like totally obscure the actual conversation. So that's a good point, Craig. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, and I think I like the word red herring because I see that also as being the strategy here. So, okay. And I think you guys want to go maybe 10 more minutes or so. Does that seem pretty reasonable? Maybe not get through the whole video.
That's fine.
But
that's fine.
Okay. All right. So here we go. Let's see what else he has to say about slavery.
Sense though you're getting rid of everything, including God, obviously, in the process of doing that. And it is your argument, Glenn, that there's a danger in doing that. You can't simply have the ethics without some of the supporting foundations, presumably, that you think are...
Which is Nietzsche's critique as well. Yeah, absolutely. That you get rid of the God of Christianity, and you must get rid of the ethics of Christianity as well, because it is founded on the God who took flesh, who became the weak one, in order to rise up again and bring us weak ones into his family. And he uniquely gives to the entire human race a dignity.
Just note he didn't take the bait.
Which you can kind of secularize that term and call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Exactly.
That's basically the Imago Dei. That's basically the image of God from Genesis chapter 1.
So wait, on one hand, you seem to be saying you can't remove God and still maintain these things, and yet you're claiming that secular humanism has done exactly that.
Secularism has done exactly that, or hasn't done exactly that?
Has done exactly that. That when I advocate for secular humanist principles, when I do that I'm basically taking the principles that you see in Christianity and just removing God from it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So clearly you can do that.
You can do that, but on what grounds now is every human being in the image of God, or now in this new updated term, is every human being?
I just want to call attention to this. He is pointing to objective morality. So he is basically about to make an argument for the grounding of our objective morality in our valuing of life. So he's the big flaw in secular humanism and atheism, if you take it to its logical extreme, logical answers, is that everything's relative. We have no goalpost, essentially. We have nothing, no foundation upon which to make a claim that my life is any more valuable than yours, or all our lives should be preserved, or we should not kill anyone, not murder anybody. So all those kind of things. You guys want to build on that? You want to listen to hear him out?
Whichever, we can keep going.
Yeah, one thing here. I think he's right, because Matt was saying, like, well, on one hand, you're saying that we have this, we can't have this morality without God, but on the other hand, you're saying that we know these things, right? And it's, I think you've even pointed this out before, SJ, on a video you did that. Well, yeah, nobody's saying that like atheists can't know what's right and wrong, because obviously from our perspective, they're created in the image of God, and since they bear the image, like they would know these things even if they didn't believe that God was the ground for these things, for example. And maybe I think that's maybe what Matt was missing there.
Exactly. And I think what you're saying is if we say objective morality exists or God exists, it's an ontological position. And a lot of atheists like to use how they come to those beliefs or an
The
epistemological
epistemological,
position,
right?
try to refute the ontological position, and that's flawed.
I'll just also say he did not take the red herring. He routed Scrivener. Is that his name? Scrivener routed it right back to the same argument he was making, and actually doubled down on it and elaborated on it. And you know, there's a lot to how he's presenting this that I think is like first rate. I really do. I think it's excellent.
Oh yeah, in fact, he's made a response video already. Scrivener's got a channel and he's made a response video where he identified 4 contradictions from Matt Dillahunty. So I'm going to try to find that response video and put that in the description so people can watch that, because he really did a good job on that.
Yeah, he's good. He's sharp.
One of the contradictions that he lists, and I'm just going to mention this before we get off because I think this was really good, was he talks about how Matt basically says that slavery is wrong. And Matt is essentially then using an objective moral standard to say that slavery in ancient times is wrong. But then Matt is an ethical relativist. So an ethical relativist can't judge the actions of people in a previous culture because they have no objective standard against which to judge it.
Yeah, that's the obvious one. I mean, that's the slavery is wrong according to who? You know, but I don't think Matt Dillahunty is a relativist. He's trying to find a way to ground morality outside of grounding it in God, but he's not saying that morality is subjective. Pretty sure he's on the page of Sam Harrison saying that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and a knowable right and wrong. They're just trying to ground it in something different than, you know, a deity, which I'm kind of with them on that. I think that's good. I think it's good when atheists do that.
When they at least get to that point where they at least agree that we have objective morality, that's good.
Right.
Now
it's like when atheists agree that it's like when atheists like Adam Friend agree that religion has sociological utility and that it's beneficial. You know, that's you're 75% of the way there. You know, if they don't want to go to church and like start praying and feel God in their heart, you know, whatever. At that point, it's like, you know, live your lifetime. Just, you know, give me the tithes anyways, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So let's hear what he has to say.
Being now included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, this is the thing that I keep running up against is I have yet to find anybody presenting an objection to secular morality that is in any way solved by appealing to a religious one. The big thing that you get to is, well, what's the foundational source and why should I care about it? This is where when Sam writes Moral Landscape and people are like, well, you haven't fully explained well-being. Of course, we haven't. I mean, this is the process where we're continuing to discover things. Well, why should anybody care about well-being is the big question that Sam always gets asked. And that this question also applies to why should anybody care about what a God says? And this is one of the things where whether or not there's a God, I don't necessarily see any evidence when I look at Christianity in particular, at least the way I understood it when I was a Christian, that there's a God who has human interests at heart. It's humans who have human interests at heart. So not only would secular humanism stand with regard to Occam's razor, but the thing that we're appealing to is the very thing that we're seeking to do, which is we care about us. Why do we care about us? We care about us because we're us. Now, when you add in the God of Christianity, you get the notion that, no, God's got a plan. You are a part of that plan. And okay, he loves you and he's making a place to either torture you or rescue you too. And he can serve as a foundation that we can point to so that we don't have to point to ourselves. But nowhere in there is there any sort of guarantee that there either is a God or B, that God has the actual best interests of humans at heart. It's just an appeal that God understands these things better than we do. And so when it seems like God doesn't have the best interests of humans at heart, that's just our failure to understand it, which is really fallacious reasoning.
Except that Christianity is about God the human.
Yeah.
So there was a few things he said there, and he's getting back into ethics and relating human ethics to God, and I think there's a mistake here, right? Because we like to talk about human normative ethics, and then we like to conflate God as if there was some type of like that we and God were on the same ethical playing field, right? So there's a couple things he said there. He said one, he talked about appealing to Occam's razor, right? I think that people sometimes appeal to that, and I just want to like make this clear for people, is that it's limit things. It's limit the cause to necessity, right? Now you can limit things all day and go, well, this is a simpler explanation, but does it meet the requirements? Like you see what I'm saying? Like it's limit your I think it's causes to necessity, or limit your explanations to necessity. But it has to meet that necessary requirement, right? It can't just be something that could possibly explain it. It has to be something that would necessarily explain it. But secondly, he talks about God having humans' best interest at heart. I talked to an atheist one time, and they said that I'm more humane than God. And I'm like, if by that you mean that you're more human than God, then that makes sense. Like it's just a tautology. But if by that you mean that humans have humans' best interest in heart more than God, or something like that case, how could you possibly know that? One, but secondly, how could you think that a limited perceiver would would know more about an ethical problem than an absolute perceiver? It's just seems like it's a very strange claim.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I want to go back to. One of the other things that Matt had slipped in there was this idea of genocide. And atheists would be the first to say, yes, we should eliminate people who are horrific. And one of the reasons why God had the Canaanites driven out of their land, and if you look at the Hebrew for that, the word is driven out of their land. It's not necessarily saying we're going to kill them, but it's driving them out of their land. One reason was just going back to this idea is because they were doing horrific things, like they were engaging in bestiality. They were burning their babies on the Malak, the god, in worship to Malak. So they were just doing some really bad things. And because God has this transcendent view, and he's concurrently in the past, present, future, God knew, he knew exactly what the potential was for those kinds of people, and he eliminated them. And that's maybe one of the reasons, if we look around today and we see how we've got this humanity that seeks to follow the golden rule and all that kind of stuff, it's God having made the choices that he's made through time to optimize how we are today. So I think that we're just discovering these values and we're going through time. But as you mentioned, God has this perspective that's far beyond ours.
It was funny because he was talking about when I was new to this, I was debating somebody back and forth either on Twitter and the comments of my videos or something, and they said something along those lines of like something alluding to the fact that they were more moral than God. And I said to them point blank, I said, you actually sound like you think you're more moral than God. And he said without any hesitation, yes, I absolutely think I'm more moral than God. I didn't realize just how absurd that actually is. I mean, I get what they're basing it on because, Old Testament did this mean thing and that mean thing, yada, yada. But if the God that we're actually positing exists, that would be the sole author of the concept of justice altogether, the concept of mercy altogether. The fact that you could it's such an absurd idea. It's so dumb. It's unbelievable. And, it's just hard it's hard not to let somebody get away with that kind of stupidity because it's so outrageous that it's hard to kind of catch them in it,
You're right. I'd like to put it in a way like this. Like when people talk about, well, wait a second, but like when they like to judge God for some ethic or something, first I'd like to say like, oh, wait a second, do you think that human normative ethics would apply to God? And like, because then it makes you think, well, these are kind of human norm, like these are kind of human rules, like odds for humans, right? Would it apply to God? Like, for example, well, it's just like if like in a deontological view, right? Moral rules would be something like the rules of a chess game. So like bishops can't move like a rook, for example, right? And so with amongst the bishops, what if a bishop were to say like, well, hold on a second, why can't we move like a pawn or something? It just seems like a really like maybe maybe chess is wrong this way or something like that. But it's like, well, if it was any different, it wouldn't be chess. Like you get what I'm saying? Like
yeah, totally. Yes, totally understand what you're saying.
So if poker was played a different way, it wouldn't be poker. Like that's the whole thing of it, is that it's based off of those rules. You know?
Right. It's hard to properly articulate the absurdity behind it, but it's ridiculous. It's like
it reminds me of the Euthyphro argument, because people talk about if something's pious, basically it's a false dichotomy in the Euthyphro argument, because the idea is that God is not, something isn't good because God desires it to be good, and then or something God desires becomes good because he desires it. I forget how that goes, but the bottom line is that God is the standard of piety, or God is the standard of righteousness, and he's written that on our minds through our conscience. What's a really neat thing is called Christian synderesis, and that is the idea that we have a conscience, and it's the blending of our reasoning and our intuitions, and it's something that can explain our morality very well. God wrote it on our hearts.
Yeah. So yeah, and I would just say, I just did a 3-hour live stream debate the other night on my channel on the Euthyphro dilemma. So that might be something interesting if anybody wants to check out something on that. Yeah,
it sounds good.
What's it called? A Christian Cinderella? What is it?
Synderesis. 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 Christian synderesis. And it's just this idea. Yeah, it's this idea that we have a conscience. So the reason I mention that is because Jonathan Haidt does a lot of work talking about our intuitions and our reasoning. And all the studies I found in morality talk a lot about intuitions and reasoning, but very few mention this idea of conscience, because they say, well, everything can be explained by our intuitions. My dog is good. She's getting annoyed. She wants to get there. Everything can be explained by intuition, but everything can't, because intuition doesn't explain why somebody would take a bullet for somebody else. Your intuition is to run away when you see danger. It's not to stand there and take the bullet, like you mentioned a little bit earlier when we first started.
Oh, interesting.
So do we have time? We'll maybe do a little bit more, and then we'll do commentary, and that's it.
Do a little more, and then call it a day. And
okay, sounds good. Here we go.
I mean, foundationally, Christianity is Christ. It's foundationally God the Son has become God our brother. We've just celebrated Christmas. It's the time at which the Word became flesh, which is just a stunning religious idea that is found nowhere else. Disgusting to my Muslim friends. You know, it's disgusting to the Greco-Roman mind. And yet, the Christian claim uniquely is that God took flesh and even became a single cell in Mary's womb, became the weak and despised thing for the sake of all weak and despised things. And I think from there you get the principle that humanity in and of itself has a dignity because God has so dignified it. Otherwise, it's us elevating humanity to a certain, position. Why should we elevate humanity to a certain position? Why should there be such a thing as human exceptionalism?
Why shouldn't there be?
Is that just a power play, right?
I mean, I'm not just asking that to like,
yep. Do you have an answer? Like, what do you think about human exceptionalism?
I don't really see any reason why it shouldn't be. Well, of course we're going to be concerned about our own well-being. Mm-hmm. When you talk about, is that
moral though, or is that just a power play?
So this is the thing when we talk about what is moral. So quite often they'll say, well, the thing you're describing, that's all well and good, but it's not morality. Fine, then I don't care about morality. You need to tell me what you're going to, because if the only thing you're going to count as morality is some sort of, divine command or a supernatural being that serves as a grounding for whatever you want to do, that's not what I think anybody's ever really cared about for morality. When we talk about morals, when we talk about this, we're evaluating the consequences of our actions with respect to some goal, and does it ultimately increase, decrease, or have no effect on our well-being?
I think this is perfect. Just to stop right here and just to comment on this, and maybe this will be towards our end, but he is exactly outlining the principles that Sam Harris came up with in the moral landscape. And so what they're trying to do is ground our morality in our consequence of well-being. And so that's circular reasoning. I just want to point that out. Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. One is, some people may not have noticed this, but this is actually a very wise thing that Scrivener did here. What Scrivener actually did there, and it's just a single term, right? It's he talks about human exceptionalism. Did you catch that phrase?
Yeah, that was beautiful.
All right. Well, think about, like, here's why that's such a good thing is, like, sometimes when you're talking to like let's say you're talking to an atheist, right? Chances are that they're on the left politically, right? And if you can take, like, for example, their beliefs in atheism and pin it against their beliefs in their politics, they won't have a way that they can't argue against their beliefs in politics, so they'll have to accept the example. So with on the left, there's this idea that there's this idea in politics that there is American exceptionalism, right? And it basically says that, hey, look, America has done better and like came up with better. It's been an exceptional place, right? It's given rights, and it's had the Industrial Revolution and all these things that have produced it and made it exceptional among the world, where no other nations like it, basically. And then the left goes, no, they're not exceptional. They got it based off of things that were wrong or whatever. So when he brings up this, why would you think human exceptionalism was the case? It's almost like if he makes an argument against human exceptionalism, then or for it, then he's going to have to. You could take that same argument and parallel it for American exceptionalism, and then he would have to accept that argument, right? So I thought that was a really smooth thing to do there. I'm not sure if he did that intentionally, but it seemed to me like he did. And then the second claim was about what was the point that you made about
well, morality. He's looking at consequences, and he's trying to ground consequences.
Yeah. So as when William Lane Craig debated Sam Harris, he said if the population could be just as happy with like psychopathic tendencies and things like that, then it would no longer be a moral landscape, but rather just a landscape of peaks and valleys of happiness or something like that. It would no longer be a moral landscape. And then he admitted in the back of his book that, well, yeah, but a certain percentage of the population do believe that. So and William Lane Craig kind of won that debate based off of that, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And he actually admitted in the back of his book, it's our preferences for helping people and generating happiness in society and well-being and that kind of stuff. It could be very different. He pointed out there could be a moral landscape where everyone's pretty evil and selfishness is elevated. And it's kind of similar to what Plato wrote about in the Republic. So that's something just to add. So I would say overall in this debate so far, and maybe we can at some point watch the rest of it, but I would say that I thought that of all of the people I've seen debate Matt Dillahunty, I always thought that Inspiring Philosophy was number one, but I got to say, I think Scrivener might have actually pulled out ahead of Inspiring Philosophy. But tomorrow, we're going to be able to go onto the Modern Day Debate channel tomorrow night and watch Inspiring Philosophy personally meet Matt Dillahunty in Austin, Texas. So it's really exciting stuff. So I think that they're both going to bring their A games. What do you guys think?
Yeah, totally. I think it's going to be great to watch. I think that Matt Dillahunty will do a lot better in tomorrow's debate because it's more neutral territory. I don't think that you can beat a prepared Inspiring Philosophy or a Scrivener if the grounds is, the sociological utility of religion, because the evidence totally favors the conclusion. So you can't really win that. Matt Dillahunty can't really win that debate. But tomorrow will be an even debate on territory that tends to favor Dillahunty a little bit more, but it'll be good to watch.
Yeah, he's in his own hometown. He's on his own home turf.
Right. He's got the home field advantage. And so he's got the home field advantage. And the other thing is, I think that Matt probably realizes that last time wasn't such a great deal for me. So I got a feeling that Matt's going to be doing some pretty significant studies and that he will be ready for this. That will make it into such like a really great matchup. Hopefully it turns out to be one of the best. And like we've been kind of talking about some of the holes in Matt's logic here, but I do think that Matt's one of the best the other side has as far as debaters. There are some a lot brighter philosophers on the other side and a lot brighter academics, but they're not very approachable, and their content isn't very digestible. They're kind of calculated and cold and dry and just kind of like well, that couldn't be the case because on page 437 of Scrivener's book he says, well,
right,
Matt interacts, and I just thought, maybe I'd give him a little credit before, at the end here. So
No, I agree with you. He's got some charisma. Matt has some charisma, and he's got a way of taking something and simplifying it that his audience finds appealing, because he can take things that are relatively complex and try to bring them down to a level that, like he said, why did God kill God? Why did God sacrifice God? He says these little phrases that people stick in their minds, and like you, going back to your heuristics, people love little shortcuts like that. Then they think, I don't have to remember much of what Matt said, but I can remember it. Let me give the audience, just for a fun little example of heuristics. I watched the OJ trial a long time ago, and OJ was as guilty as it comes. I mean, he was so guilty. It was just unbelievable to me that the jury let him off. But there was one very clever little phrase that Johnny Cochran came up with, and it was, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. So they could forget all the forensic evidence, all of the smoking gun essentially pointing to OJ's guilt. And if they just remember that one little phrase, which I think that was what pretty much won that whole thing, then totally people, they had their shortcut.
Yeah, it's memorable. It even rhymes, and it underscores, like, it cuts through like 50,000 pages of arguments and just chisels it down to something that's totally, it's brilliantly placed.
What Do You Meme just did a video on that, actually. It's called something like, I don't know, something about slogans on the left, and I think he used, if I'm remembering correctly, he used Matt Dillahunty as a prime example, and I don't remember the example specifically that he gave, but like one I'm thinking of is like when people say, like, you can't prove a universal negative, like you can't prove a negative, what? And then I go, oh, I can't prove that there's not a Tyrannosaurus Rex on top of the Empire State Building? You're saying I can't prove that? And then they'll just be like, oh, well, I mean, like, what they should rather say is, like, it depends on the claim. Like, there's some negatives you can't prove, right? Is there a teapot floating in space around Saturn or something like that? But it depends on the claim. So
and they also use that inappropriately usually, because, like, somebody said to me, I think, you can't prove there's a unicorn. You can't prove there's not an invisible unicorn if there's not an invisible unicorn. I'm like, if you set the parameters, you can. You can't if it's purely imagination. But if you give the invisible unicorn properties and you set the parameters, like it's in my apartment, then yeah, of course you could prove it. There's not an invisible unicorn in my because they're using that argument for God. And if you have like characteristics of God, of course you could prove one way or the other. We'll get there. It's like they're just using it as if it's totally imaginary. Like, you could not prove that there's not an invisible unicorn if you have no limitations. But if you say there's not an invisible unicorn with properties X, Y, Z, P to Q in my apartment, of course you could prove that. Find a series of studies to prove that there isn't one. There probably is one, but you could prove that there wasn't one.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And I'm going to listen to What Do You Meme's video that talks about these shortcuts and that kind of thing, because I think that's the slogans. That is something that some of them have been using. Tracy Harris is another one that uses these slogans. I'm more moral than God. Anyone can remember that. Oh yeah, I can go say that. I'm more moral than God. So it's that idea of these catchy little one-liners that people can remember. And Matt's good at that. And I mean, I'll give him credit for that. And so that's something that we would also want to think of on our side when we go into debates. If you can come up with good little slogans, because I was listening to somebody's debate tactics, and the person had a bunch of catchy slogans. Frank Turek's got a bunch of them. He has a bunch of very catchy. I've more faith. How does it? I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I mean, that's pretty good.
Well, on the surface that is good, but I would just warn you against one thing there with that one. So I think you're right about that, though. But with that one, I've heard that a lot, and I used it like years ago, like a long time ago. But here's one thing that's kind of tacitly built into that, and I just want you to be aware that way, in case you were to say it and somebody were to catch you on it. It's if you say something like I hear a lot of people say, well, I don't have the faith to believe in atheism or something like that, and they go, well, do you mean by that faith means there's no evidence for it? Because I thought faith had evidence. And then you see what I'm saying? They can take that and go, well, if you mean like that atheism is a faith position, by that you mean that there's some evidence that supports it, but you don't know it. You know what I mean? Like they're like, you're assuming that it means that there's no evidence for faith. And so that's why I just want to warn against that, just in case somebody uses that one. There is like a brief response, but but if you use it in a way that like I don't have enough evidence, I mean enough faith to buy into atheism, then that would probably negate that, because it's like saying, well, there is evidence, but there's little evidence, right?
Mhm.
So sorry, but I just thought that would be
It's catchy.
interesting.
It drives atheists crazy though. So that one's catchy. That's the thing about it. It's memorable.
Yeah.
But it drives atheists up the wall. I'm not sure if that one's actually kind of works well, but definitely it's right in the catchy department. Whatever happened to Tracy Harris when she left Atheist Experience? She seems to have disappeared from the atheist community, as far as I know,
Did she
right?
leave? I didn't know she left Atheist Experience. Are you
Yeah,
listening to that, Craig? Is that what you're doing on
yeah,
Sundays?
I listen to them almost every week. I listen to them when Matt Dillahunty's on. I'm going to make a video of what he did last week, by the way. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
What did he do?
They had a guy on. All right, I'll explain this in detail in my video, but they had a guy on who called up, presents himself as an agnostic, not a Christian, and he starts talking about Tesla, and he starts referencing things that were said by Tesla and Einstein. Tesla and Einstein, okay, not Frank
Nikola
Turek.
Tesla.
Yeah, not Lee Strobel. And Matt Dillahunty starts, and he basically throws out a concept that's pretty standard issue metaphysical speculation. And Matt Dillahunty and Dan Barker both like kind of team up on this guy as if he's talking total woo nonsense. And what he said was like totally reasonable, totally down to earth. Any smart agnostic I know could speculate along the same lines. Kind of this idea of like cosmic consciousness, when Tesla said something like to the effect of, when I produce my brilliant ideas, there's some sort of force that like I'm connected to a universal mind type thing, standard issue metaphysical speculation. And Matt Dillahunty basically just starts going like, what does this have? Like, what do those guys have to say about, God? Like, those guys don't know anything. I'll explain in my video. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It was like, I mean, they acted like the guy said, the earth is 6,000 years old, and the animals could have lived on the ark because they treated him the exact same way. And he was saying things that were basically totally down to earth, totally rational, totally reasonable. And they acted like he said these like wildly outlandish things that he didn't say. So you'll see. I'll make the video on it.
Oh, that sounds good. I just have I'm going to go, there's one question. Somebody says, anybody seen IP's new video? IP just did a video on if atheists are more intelligent. And he found a meta-analytic study and he sort of picked it apart. But just one thing I want to note for statistics, in case people are interested in statistics, because there's a lot of mention of correlations and people talk a lot about correlations. But if you have a correlation, that's essentially an R. If you want to talk about variation, that's R squared. So you would have to square the correlation to understand what the variation is. In other words, if I want to say what the variance explained is in one particular variable or a bunch of variables impacting other variables, I'm going to square the correlation coefficient. So that I just want to make sure people realize that. It's just kind of a little technical thing.
So yeah, I haven't listened to his video yet. But yes, Tracy Harris has disappeared, as far as I know, since she hasn't been on Atheist Experience. She disappeared in that essence of thought controversy when they were all mad because rationality rules stuff? Transgender. Yeah, rationality rules appeared on their broadcast, and there was this whole big to-do, like, I can't believe you let that transphobe broadcast, and that's what started the ball rolling. A couple people quit. Jen Peoples, Tracy Harris, I'm pretty sure it was directly linked to his appearing on it and how it was handled from there. There's more to the story, but that's what I had to do. Yeah,
I would like, that's what actually it said right in the end of that video with Glen Scrivener and Matt Dillahunty. The part that I didn't get to hear, they were going to talk about that whole issue. And that's now, I think that's behind his, I think that's in, you have to be a member of his group to be able to watch that, unfortunately, because I was curious to see what happened there.
Well, thanks for having me, SJ, and it was nice talking to you guys. I always appreciate your opinions. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, this is fun. Well, we're doing this again next week. We're going to analyze the debate, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We got to do that again. So yes, we will be back on to analyze the debate that's on Saturday. So everybody stay tuned. Get on to Modern Day Debate tomorrow to watch this debate. There's another debate tonight on Modern Day Debate that's live from there too. Nathan Ormond, I think, or Nathan Thompson. Nathan Thompson, I think. Nathan, that was one of the names. I didn't catch the other name, but there, a couple people debating in real person tonight.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think
So
yeah,
we'll-
Awesome.
it'll be interesting.
Yeah. Great.
And I'll see. I'm going to be on. Actually, James and I have been talking. I'm gonna probably mod more for Modern Day Debate moving forward. Now I've got some free time because instead of having school class on Thursdays, I'm gonna. My teacher said we didn't have to, so that'd be pretty cool.
Nice.
Um,
All right, kiddos. I'll talk to you soon.
All right,
I'm gonna
kids.
go ahead and end the stream. All right.
Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.